I'm Carroll Massar, along with Stephen Carroll. We're here at the Plaza in New York City. Of course, the Bloomberg Global Business Forum getting underway as we speak, and talking a lot about, as you know, about climate change and climate initiatives. Having said that, let's just throw out a couple of stats in terms of setting the stage when it comes to wind. The World Economic Forum says that last year, the global wind industry installed a record 117 gigawatts of new capacity. That's a 50% increase from the previous year. Countries across the globe are investing in both onshore and offshore wind capacities. China leading the pack, adding substantially new capacity annually. And of course, we know that's because they get a lot of support by the government, and they've got a very ambitious 5-year plan.
Yeah, this is all, we're thinking again about that 2030 deadline to triple renewables capacity, one of the key goals set at last year's UN Climate Summit. So to talk about the journey as to how we get there and how the industry is dealing with this, we've got Ben Backwell with us here in the Plaza, CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, an international organisation dedicated to promoting wind power as a key solution as we're thinking about renewables mix as well. Let's talk about where we are on the journey to wind power. We just talked through the great year of expanding capacity. Where does that get us on that goal that we're looking towards 2030, tripling renewables capacity?
Well, the good news is that we're going quite fast in terms of expanding. As you said, a record year, and we expect to break those records every single year going forward.
Yeah.
The bad news is that we're not on a trajectory to triple renewables. We're probably on a kind of doubling trajectory by 2030. So we go 117 last year. We think we're going to be at 130 this year, 148 next year. So it's building. But we probably need to be growing about maybe twice as fast to be on a net zero.
Why aren't we?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think the main reason is that everything is just too slow. So planning around the world continues to be a barrier. I mean, it takes twice or 3 times as long to plan and permit an offshore wind farm than it does to actually build one. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the technology, the capacity to build, it's there. In terms of red tape and bureaucracy, we've got a long way to go. So that's probably number one. And then secondly, we're facing some market imbalances as well. I mean, there's been kind of race to the bottom pricing in some areas, which has then led to the projects not being profitable. We've had a bout of inflation. You've seen in the impact a year ago in the US. Some of the projects had to go back and renegotiate because of inflation. So there's some new kind of headwinds, but we're speeding up and we're going where we need to.
What about public money incentives and all of this as well? I mean, it's something that, we think about the Green Deal in the EU, Inflation Reduction Act here in the US. Are the public incentives actually doing the job they're supposed to in boosting expansion, or is it being undone by the obstacles that you're talking about?
So generally, we don't need subsidy financing for the projects, right? Because our levelized cost of energy is competitive with pretty much anything out there, especially vis-a-vis oil and gas fired projects and nuclear. So generally, we don't need subsidy. Having said that, there's places, especially in the global south and the emerging world, where they're just getting started. Yeah. And where the initial projects will be more expensive than the projects in the mature markets, right? So if you think of somewhere like the Philippines and Southeast Asia, I mean, they're starting from a virtual standing start. They've got to build the infrastructure, they've got to build the grid, they've got to build the ports. And so there's a kind of gap, I think, in financing for some of those emerging markets, countries.
Where's the growth, onshore, offshore?
So onshore is still the biggest part of the market, but offshore is growing faster. So the compound growth rate for offshore is faster. Onshore is still, 85% of the market. And what's interesting is that the onshore market is really picking up again with new countries. So Germany's really speeded up. The US, we're expecting to really speed up from this year onwards, right? So the IRA has had a transformative effect on the onshore market. It's taken a little bit longer than we thought, but we can really see now the construction starting, a huge amount of projects in construction. So from next year, we'll really start to see the US onshore market really take off. And then there's India speeding up as well. There's Australia's doing really well. And there's a bunch of new markets that are growing as well.
The red tape issues that you talk about, what is the message you're getting from policymakers on that? I'm sure this is something that you're engaging with them regularly on it. You were speaking to leaders here at your event here too. I'm keen to know how exactly that conversation is going. Is it coming back to people don't want wind farms near their homes? Is it much more complex than that? Is it a systems problem? Where's the roadblock?
I'd say it's mainly a systems problem, and there's been quite a lot of recognition around this problem for the last few years. I mean, we started at COP26 in Glasgow 3-4 years ago. We started really trying to put this on the agenda. It kind of sounds like a bit of a boring issue, and so it's kind of hard to get people's attention around it. You know, it's about permitting after all. But it's pretty important. And what's happened since then is a number of countries are passing new regulation and new laws. For instance, in Germany, I mean, they've now made permitting offshore wind farms what they call overriding national interest. So that means that in the legal system, unless there's a very good reason to object, the project will be approved, right? So changes like that are good.
I wanted to ask you about a particular issue that came up in Europe this summer when we had such production coming out of particularly Spain and Norway that the price of power dropped below zero, which kind of sounds in some ways like a huge triumph, but doesn't make for a great business case. How do you sort of address that problem, which is down to storage, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem, and I'm seeing it, you know, as you are in more and more markets at different times. And it's partly a function of having just a lot more variable power on the system, so a lot of solar and a lot of wind, which means that at certain times of day you've got a real abundance of power on the system. But it's ultimately down to two things. One is the market design, to make sure that the market design is kind of built around those new sources of energy. And secondly, it's about interconnectivity. So obviously the more connected you are, and this goes to Iberia, right, and Spain and Portugal, the more connected you are to the rest of Europe, the more the market will work in a balanced way, right? So we've got to work more on grid connectivity and connectivity generally around the system, right?
In the United States in particular, I spent a lot of time on the water, and for the first time saw, the turbines off of some of the islands in the United States. But I just do wonder, there is a pushback, it feels like, whether it's, Nantucket or Block Island or something, where people are pushing back on some of these. How does that perception change in the United States? How do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, I'd separate two things, maybe. So the first thing is people's genuine concern over the impact and the impact on nature, which as an industry we're very attuned to. And after all, most of us are here because we care about climate change and the environment, and so we want to do things in a way that's the best possible way possible. That offshore wind farms are nature positive and so on. So that's genuine, and I think the way to do that is to ensure the highest quality, the best standards of consultation, working with communities, and so on. Now, the other issue is disinformation, and organised disinformation, I think, is something that the renewables industry as a whole should be paying a lot more attention to, and civil society, journalists, editors should be paying a lot more attention to. I mean, we've seen organised disinformation around offshore wind, so the idea that offshore wind is somehow killing whales, even when there was no construction going on at that time, and organised disinformation with AI-generated images purporting to show marine wildlife that's been harmed by offshore wind. That has then copied and pasted to places like Australia. It's been copied and pasted into places like Europe.
Right.
And that's disinformation.
That's another conference, the misinformation that's out there, like pick your industry, right? It makes it much more difficult. Ben, thank you, though, for finding time for us.